Well, welcome again to the last installment of the Gospel According to. I'm going to hurt somebody. I'm going to put that thing down. Good morning again, everybody, and welcome to Crossroads. We are talking about something that you may not have ever thought you would hear talked about in church, but I'll tell you why, so nobody leave just yet. Give me a few seconds to get the premise out. Because if you're just joining us, we have been in a series called The Gospel According To. And each week we've looked at a different story, a different media source. And the reason that we're doing that is not because we're promoting or bashing anything, but it's because of this one premise that I believe that many of the most popular stories of our day, whether they're songs or music or movies, include the gospel in them, which is the greatest story ever told, and it's true. It's actually a true story. And so what we've been doing each week is talking about the gospel elements in a currently popular story genre, and in showing how that's part of the gospel, but then now let's complete the story. And our goal is twofold. One, that we would become really good at telling our story, the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ, in a compelling way, because it is compelling. And then secondly, that we would begin to change the culture, because our culture is enamored with the gospel. They just don't recognize it as that. So that's why the sword and the throne and the Game of Thrones is our final topic for this series. Now, a huge disclaimer at the beginning here. Just like every other one that we've done, Avengers or the NFL or Stranger Things, I'm not promoting and telling you that you should watch the Game of Thrones. Most of you probably should not watch the Game of Thrones, in fact. But if you have, I'm not telling you that you shouldn't come to church or that we're judging you, because I watched it. And so I'm not telling anybody to watch it. It's a gruesome story. It's violent. It's immoral in many ways. And so is the Bible. The Bible has stories that are very much violent and brutal and sometimes just downright immoral in their storytelling. And so I'm not telling you to watch the Game of Thrones. Many of you shouldn't, definitely don't let your kids watch it at this point. But I am telling you to read the Bible. And sometimes when I looked at the stories that both of them were telling, there wasn't all that much difference in them. I'll show you what I mean. I put together a little trivia quiz called Bible or Game of Thrones, okay? And so I'll give you the story, and then you just turn to your neighbor and tell them if you think this is the Bible or the Game of Thrones, okay? And so if you've seen the Game of Thrones, some of these might be easier for you. If you've read the Bible before, some of these might be easier for you. But my guess is you're going to get a few wrong, and so here we go. You can just keep score at home, and we'll see how we do, okay? So I have to skip over maybe the most obvious one, because I talked about it a couple of weeks ago. I could have said there was a guy who killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. And you would go, that can't be real. That's in the Bible. That's Samson. But I talked about that already. So, all right, here's number one. A man seen as a great leader gets drunk and sleeps with his daughter, and then the next night does the same thing with a different daughter. Go ahead and say what you think. Yeah, that's in the Bible. Yeah, no kidding. That's the story of Noah, and that's actually in the Bible. Okay, ready for number two? The son of the king and heir to the throne schemes with one of the king's advisors to trap his sister in a chamber so that he can rape her. After he does, her other brother hears about it, but tells her to do nothing because, after all, it's their brother. But then he plans to get revenge so that he can get the throne. Turn Game of Thrones or Bible. That one is also Bible. Yeah, some of you are like, I need to start reading the Bible. That's just juicy stuff. Yeah, and it's horrible, that story of David's son Absalom and Tamar. It's a horrible story. That's in the Bible. All right, a couple more. Two families arrange a marriage for military reasons, but at the wedding, one family kills the other. Yeah, it's Game of Thrones. Some of you who have seen it, it's a pivotal part. I should have said there's a few spoilers here, but you'll forget it by the time you watch it if you haven't watched it yet. All right, a couple more. A famous leader believes he has been instructed by God to sacrifice his child. Yeah, you know what? That's both. That storyline is in both the Bible and the Game of Thrones. Abraham is told to sacrifice his son Isaac, and there's a storyline in the Game of Thrones that a king is told to sacrifice his child. All right, two more. A woman clothed in white wearing a crown appears with a seven-headed dragon. Her son was to rule the nations with an iron scepter. Bible. It's in the book of Revelation. Yeah, the dragon threw you off, didn't it? Yeah, that's in the Bible. Last one. The wife of the king is threatened by a leader of a group that's speaking out against the throne. So she asks for the king to give the leader's head to her, and he delivers. That's both. That happens in both the Bible. That happens in the Game of Thrones. What's my point here? My point is that let's not just disregard the story, because it is violent and it is gruesome and it involves the human nature at its worst. Because so does the Bible. And so just stay with me for a few minutes, because there's a number of different messages that we can learn from the way that this story gets told. Now, if you're not familiar with the story at all, that's okay. Similar to other stories that we've looked at, it has a pretty recognizable Christ figure in it. In the Game of Thrones, this person's name is Jon Snow. And yeah, here's a picture of him. Jon Snow is born under mysterious circumstances. He's quickly hidden away by his father, but it's not his biological father, to escape from a king who wants to murder him as a baby. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, Jesus being taken to Egypt so Herod wouldn't kill him. Jon Snow is betrayed by a supposed friend. That's a familiar story, right? Jon Snow is killed for teaching people to love one another, especially the people who are on the wrong side of the wall. Yeah. So one thing after another, the gospel story is embedded in this most popular TV series of all time. If you count together all of the live watches on HBO, all of the streaming watches, all the downloads, if you threw in all the pirated copies, it's way over every other series. And one of the reasons, I'm not saying it's the only reason, one of the reasons that people are just drawn to it was because the gospel's in it. The show is really a struggle of power between four main families. I've got someone here representing all four of those families. The Stark family, represented by Jon, the Lannister family, the Targaryen family, and the Greyjoy family. I'm not going to go into all of that because you don't need to know that anyway. There's actually 9 families that battle for power back and forth over 8 seasons. That's sort of the storyline, is who's going to get power, who's going to get to sit in the throne and rule the 7 kingdoms. But the struggle, we find out at some point during the show, is not simply against flesh and blood. It is against a more sinister and evil power. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, you might be familiar with this verse. The Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 6, "For our struggle is not only against flesh and blood, it's against the powers, the principalities, the ruler of the dark kingdom." That's the way the Apostle Paul described part of the challenge of living in this world. Now, that force in the Game of Thrones is illustrated by and is played by this character. He's called the Night King. And the Night King leads an army of dead people against the living people, which is sort of, maybe that's Walking Dead or zombies, and you're not into that. But just stop for a minute and think with me about what that message is. That for all of the fighting that we do to gain power here in our kingdom, in our world, there is one enemy that we all face together, and that there is no easy way to defeat. And that enemy is death, right? We talked about that the last couple of weeks, that's the enemy we don't stand a chance against. And the same is true in the show. There's really very few options on how to stop this enemy that they all share in common. And part of the show is trying to see, will they ever stop fighting each other so that they can take care of what's actually the problem that nobody can solve. There's a phrase that gets repeated over and over again in the show, and they say it in a different language, but the phrase is, all men must die. And the refrain, when you say that, is, all men must serve. And the more I thought about that, I thought, man, those are two cornerstones of the search for faith, isn't it? That we've talked about in the past few weeks. We don't get to choose whether we're going to worship or not. We don't choose whether we're going to put something at the center of our lives or not. We're going to serve something. All men must serve. And in the midst of that, there is an enemy that we are utterly powerless against. The enemy of death. All men must die. All men must serve. And it's within that context that this story unfolds of the throne. And the gospel theme that I want to talk about in our time that we have together today is a more central to the show than specific. I could take specific episodes and quotes, and they're all over the place. But what I want to do is paint the picture of the whole gospel story and how it revolves around the throne. In other words, to be more comprehensive instead of elemental. Instead of one element of the gospel, let me show you how the whole thing unfolds. And it has to do with the throne. And so let me start by asking a couple questions about the throne. Who sits on one of those? A king or a queen, could be a queen. A ruler, maybe it doesn't matter what they're called, but a ruler sits on the throne, and they do what from there? They rule, which means what? That they make the rules. They say what goes, and their kingdom is defined by the place where what they say goes. That's what a kingdom is. It's the extent of your will. And so when you sit on this in the show, it is the 7 kingdoms where whatever you say goes. And so there's all kinds of kingdoms. And every time there's a new person that sits on the throne, they usually promise a new kind of kingdom. That still happens in our day, doesn't it? With an election or with a new neighborhood council person. They come into there, my kingdom's going to be different. I'm going to have different rules and different values, to live by. And so they try to enact their new rules and everything like that. And depending on how powerful they are, the extent of their will might not reach actually anyone, right? They just say it and nobody does it. Or maybe they're very powerful and they say it and everybody does it. But the interesting thing to me is that there's always somebody coming and saying, I'm going to bring a new kingdom. I'm going to usher in a new kingdom. And they're really not new. Right? So the idea of it's not actually all that new. It's just a tweak of some of the old ones. It's a little bit here, a little bit there, until Jesus. Until Jesus shows up and he says, I have a new kingdom, and it's not a tweak. It's a complete overhaul. It's a completely different set of rules and values, unlike any of the existing kingdoms. And it turns out that the Game of Thrones does a fabulous job of telling how that kingdom will come. And so does the Bible. So let's use both, okay? Let's start with the Bible. The Bible does a fantastic job. Many of the writers in the Old Testament talked about this coming kingdom. And if you look, it tells you how it's going to come. So let me read to you out of an Old Testament book, the book of Daniel. And I'm going to be reading out of Daniel chapter 2. So if you have a Bible, you can open that up and find Daniel chapter 2. It's in the Old Testament, the first half of the Bible. And as you're doing that, let me set the stage for you. This is a book, as several are in the Old Testament, where the people of God, the people of Israel, sometimes they're called, have been led out of slavery in Egypt, and then they've entered into the promised land. Now, that whole journey is a big story, and that's not our story for today. It takes them a long time to get there, but they finally get there, and now they're in the land that God promised them. But they don't remember to worship God there. Again, I could give a whole sermon on that. When you get what you want, sometimes it's easy to forget to worship God, and they do, repeatedly. And so sometimes when they do, they get attacked and defeated. And one of the times that they are attacked and defeated, it's by the king of Babylon. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. And they made up Veggie Tales about him. And so if you have kids, you maybe have sung the bunny song, and that's Nebuchadnezzar. If you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, it's worth Google it, and you'll find out the bunny song from Veggie Tales. Anyway, that's Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar goes in, and he defeats the king of Israel, and he actually does it twice. Because the first time he goes in, he just takes away 10,000 of the professionals that are in Judah at the time. He takes away the artists and the politicians and the academics, and you see why he would do that. So he's like, instead of taking them all, I'll just take all the ones that shape their culture. And so that's what happened. And then 10 years later, he went back and he basically ransacked the whole city and took all of the occupants back to Babylon. So why am I telling you all that? Because he was crazy. He's a crazy king, maybe one of the most powerful people in the world at that point, sitting on one of these. Whatever he said, that's what goes in all of the Near East at that time. And so he has a dream. The poor guy has a bad dream, and he wants someone to tell him what the dream means. And so he asks all of the wise men gathered in his court, the people who serve the king, the wisest people, all of his advisors, and he asks them to interpret his dream. The catch is, he won't tell him what the dream was, which I think is pretty smart of him. He's like, if you're so smart, I shouldn't have to tell you what the dream is for you to tell me what the dream means. And, that's like those, fortune tellers, and then, something awful happens to them, and you're like, well, you should have been able to know that, right? So he's like, I'm not going to tell you. You have to tell me what it is. And none of them can do it. And he's so mad at them, he makes this decree: I'm going to kill all of you since you can't tell me. This is in the Bible. Since you can't tell me my dream. Okay, that's where we pick up the story. Have I caught your interest yet? And so starting in chapter 2, verse 24, the book of Daniel, this is what happens. Daniel shows up on the scene. Then Daniel, he's from Judah. He's one of the 10,000 people that have gotten exiled to Babylon. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, of whom Daniel was one, and said to him, do not execute the wise men of Babylon, or me, in parentheses. Take me to the king, and I will interpret the dream for him. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I've found a man along with the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, "No wise man or enchanter or magician or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made with gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. And while you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken into pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. I'll skip down to verse 44. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and the interpretation is worthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel, paid him honor, and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him, which means he didn't get it at all. But we can. But we can learn some things about how this kingdom that Jesus came to proclaim is being talked about 1,000 years or more before Jesus actually showed up. And if we pay attention to this, in this scripture are many, many things we can learn about this kingdom and how it comes. We can learn them from Daniel. We can learn them from the dream. And maybe most importantly, we can learn them from the rock. And so let's start with Daniel. We can learn a lot from Daniel. And it says he's got two names in verse 25. Did you notice that? That it says he was called Daniel and he was called Belteshazzar. So this begs a couple of questions and how we can learn something from Daniel. First, why the two names? And second, why is the guy from God's people serving this evil king who just, took control and wiped out all of God's people? Why is he one of the trusted advisors at all? And the understanding of this principle about the kingdom of God is really what this entire series is based on. It's based on an understanding that's not very common in our day, and I have to think it wasn't very common in any day. And so that's what makes it so radical and new and not just a tweak of an old system. Because the exile took these people away, and at first, all of the people from Judah all camped outside the city of Babylon. And they were set up there, and they had prophets that were telling them, don't go into the city, pray against the city. If we go in there, we're going to get contaminated, and those people are evil. We're the good people. And so you can read about that. Hezekiah is a prophet who was saying, we have to stay here, stay secluded, hold our ground, and not go in. And there's another prophet, actually, back still in Jerusalem, a guy named Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is a famous prophet, and he's writing about the same time while this little camp is outside the city. And Jeremiah, in one of the most famous chapters in the book that he wrote. It's not famous if you've never read it, but if you've read the book of Jeremiah, there's one verse that gets quoted all the time. Jeremiah 29:11. I'm not even going to say it because you'll go look it up. That'll make it interesting for you. But what happened right before that gives so much context to that verse that we use, I think, probably in the wrong way a lot of times. So let me read to you what this prophet, don't lose me here, this prophet in Judah is writing to these people who are camped outside of Babylon, not wanting to go in. Jeremiah 29, and I'll start in verse 4. He says, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." So there they are, all the people in the camp. "Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce. Marry, have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which you've been carried. I gotta get this right. To which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, the city, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord." What does he say? He says, look, I don't want you to separate from this city, Babylon, and its culture. I know that's what you're being told, but I don't want you to do that. Nor do I want you to assimilate to that culture. I don't want you to stop being people who worship the one true God in a pluralistic, polytheistic culture. But I do want you to be a part of it. Don't stay secluded, don't stay separated, and don't assimilate. There's a third option. There's a third option that God calls his people to then and calls his people to now. He says, look, I don't want you to love me and hate that city. Nor do I want you to love that city and forget about me. There's a third option. Love me and love the city. Love me and bring peace. Now, that's just not the absence of violence. You might know that peace used in that way is total flourishing. Everything as it was intended to be. Everyone gets to win. That's what that peace is. And God says, that's what I want you to bring to these people. And they're like, well, yeah, but didn't they just overtake us? And God says, yeah, because I let them. I took you here. This is part of the plan. I'm going to use this in a way that you have no idea right now. So the first thing we can learn about how the kingdom comes, remember that's what we're learning. How does this new kingdom that Jesus is bringing, how does it come? Well, first it comes not by separating from our culture or assimilating to our culture, but by being a part of our culture and still loving God. That's the first thing we learn from Daniel. Okay, but then what do we learn from the dream? The dream that the king has that Daniel comes and interprets. It's a dream that a lot of people have interpreted it a lot of different ways, a lot of very complex. Who's the gold kingdom? Who's the silver kingdom? Because Daniel goes in the part that I skipped and goes through and talks about all these different kingdoms. You're this kingdom, and then another one's going to come, and then another one's going to come. And finally, there's one that's never going to end. And the interpretation is way too complex for what Nebuchadnezzar even cares about, right? Here's why. If you're the first kingdom, how many more do you care about that are going to follow after you? That would be zero. Yeah. All he needed to know was yours isn't going to last, right? It doesn't really matter what happens after that because he's gone anyway. And the truth of it is that it didn't matter whether it was gold or silver or bronze or iron or clay and iron mix. It didn't matter what happened was they all fell because the foundation wasn't any good. The foundation was weak. It was the weakest part of the whole thing. And when that goes, everything goes. Which I think also tells us about the coming of this new kingdom that Jesus wants to bring, has brung, invites us to live in. That the king, Nebuchadnezzar, wanted to build a great statue of himself so that everyone would notice his greatness. And the basis of the dream is that won't ever last. As great as you are right now, Nebuchadnezzar, you might be the most powerful man in the world right now. It will not last. It reminds me of all men must die. All men must serve. Nothing lasts. In one of the last episodes of the last season, one of the characters in Game of Thrones says, nothing lasts. That's the truth of this dream. I want everyone to see my greatness. It will not last because of the foundation. And the truth is, everyone's building a kingdom. Everyone is a part of some kingdom. The question is, what's the foundation of yours? Will it last? Because there's one, apparently, that's going to last forever. That's the kingdom I want to be a part of. And so we'll finish with this. We've learned from Daniel, we've learned from the dream. What do we learn from the rock? It says twice that the rock is not a function of natural occurrence, but a supernatural, and it's not cut out by the hands of men. The rock is the least valuable substance in the whole dream, right? Gold, silver, bronze, iron. I've offered you a choice, bars of gold or this rock. It's not a hard choice. It's the least valuable. It's the smallest. It doesn't say a big boulder. It says a rock. There's a rock. A rock like that you can throw. And this huge statue. So the rock is supernatural. It's the least valuable. And it's the smallest. And what happens with the rock? It smashes all the other kingdoms. It brings them down because their foundation wouldn't last. And so therein lies a picture of this kingdom that Jesus is bringing. It's small at the start, but it grows. What does it grow into? It says it grows into a mountain for the whole world. Now, it's not the mountain that crushes the statue, is it? It's the little rock. The rock that's the beginning that becomes a mountain. And this, it's the ultimate power of the completely different kingdom, not just a little tweak on the old one. The power of the ultimate kingdom doesn't look like power at the beginning. It looks like weakness. It doesn't look like it's going to be anything, and it becomes everything. This is the story of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. This is the story of of Game of Thrones. that the people who end up being the heroes and people of power, the people who end up making the biggest difference in the end, have the least power at the beginning. It's a dwarf, a bastard child, an abused and abandoned girl, and a crippled boy. And they look like forever they're just the ones that are going to be abused and thrown to the corner of the story. And just like in the kingdom of God, it's in weakness and vulnerability that the hope of the world is found. Gospel according to the Game of Thrones or gospel according to Jesus Christ? Yes. The story was the same. They just took our story. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul wrote, God has used the powerful things, the weak things of this world to shame the powerful. Yeah. That's the model in which God does it. The cross, and we'll stop here. The cross is not only an invitation to new life. It's a pattern for that new life. Do you see that? In other words, the cross invites us to a new relationship with God, but it also invites us to a new way of living, a new set of rules and values to live by, ones that don't end. And it doesn't look powerful at the time, but love and mercy and compassion are the tools of the kingdom that will have ultimate power. So, this is the gospel. Power is found in vulnerability. Love and mercy are surprisingly stronger than power and status. The poor and the weak will not only inherit the earth, they will save it. And we're invited to live in that kingdom. Let me pray as we get ready to close. Father, thank you for your kingdom that never ends. Thank you for the way that you invite us to live in it. Thank you for the pattern of that kingdom that sometimes doesn't look like much now, but will last forever and will include the whole world. I pray that you'd give us wisdom to respond to the invitation that you give us today. We pray in your name. Amen.